might as well get started. Okay, well, here we are. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this first attempt at a webinar, certainly the first one that I've been involved with here. I'd like to thank all of my colleagues for helping set it up, and I'm going to introduce you to some of my colleagues a little bit later who will be carrying on the next episodes of the series for me. This talk is called Open Source and Why Open Source Matters for Your Organization, specifically why it might matter to an NPO, certainly a young, ambitious NPO, one that we're hoping that is here in our audience today. I hope it'll be an interesting talk for you. Like I say, we're going to have questions at the end of it. And we're going to get in after my talk, which is mostly about the sort of big picture idea and the principles and history behind it. Then we'll get into some of the technical details in the follow-on episodes. When we're talking about open source with organizations here, we are often talking about sort of high-level strategic questions like these ones. What sort of value does open source as an idea bring to the organization? What's the market benefit of it? What's the operational benefits of it? What are the trade-offs of what does it cost, and so on? Who's liable for these things if things go wrong is a question that we often get asked as well. And in the larger sense, like, how do we think and talk strategically about these ideas? And how do we plan ahead using this as a powerful tool? And then the conversations tend to get a little bit strange, because we talk about not just open source, but Mozilla, we believe, beyond the idea of open source on its own, we also believe in the ideas of working in the open, I should say, and open collaboration. And once we've described to people what working in the open involves and what open collaboration means to us, then suddenly the discussion looks a little bit different. And people have a very different set of questions about this. Like questions that aren't suddenly about strategic necessities, but like, why do you do this to yourselves at all? Like, are you okay? We get questions that go very quickly from what is the strategic value of this to do you need a hug? And I'd like to convince you here that it's actually a good idea. And I'm going to ask you to bear with me while we do that. But a more important question for a lot of organizations, particularly NPOs, is a much simpler question. Like, so what? Like, we're not a software shop, probably not a software shop. And for us, these things are tools, they're just a means to an end, right? Like, I don't know how often we look under the hood of our cars, but we have places to go. We have things to do, right? This seems like a lot of very odd, very unfamiliar, and very extra work. And we've already got a lot of extra work. So why? So why should we do this at all? Why do we want to be a part of this? And I'd like to try over the course of the time we spend here to convince you that this is, our reasons for it are sound, right? That when it gets right down to it, to spoil the punchline here, we believe that this is the right way to work. And not just for software shops, right? Not just for people who are typing in code and having it go out into the world, but actually for anybody whose success, anybody whose growth, anybody whose aspirations depend on the ability to find allies, the ability to find mutual support, the ability to find common goals with people, right? And the ability to collaborate effectively with other organizations in the world where there's overlap with what you're doing, what you're trying to do, and what you're trying to achieve. And so we're going to walk through that today, and we're going to walk through that, how we've arrived at these conclusions. And more importantly, I guess, how these conclusions have evolved over time and what we've learned in the time that we've spent sharpening these tools. And I want to thank you all for joining me on this sort of basically a history lesson of Mozilla, how we got here and why we believe that it's the right way to work. But it's not just that it's the right way to work, I should say. There's something more to it than this. It's actually a pretty good way to live, right? It's a pretty great way to actually not just do your work, but to develop and foster your working environment. None of these things on my list here are exactly on point, right? None of these things here are quite at the very top end of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? None of these things are self-actualization. But all of these things, you maybe have strong feelings about them, maybe you like them, maybe you don't like them, but you're probably, once you've got them, you're not going to be willing to easily go back to not having them. And the experience of working and developing in the open and working in an open source model, after a while, it's very much like that. Those of you who've ever had a fancy bike fitted for you, for example, will recognize a lot of this feeling. Once you've been doing this for a while, it's the difference between, this is a nice enough bike, this is a nice enough ride. And once it's fitted for you really well, all of a sudden it's like, no, this is more than just a nice ride. This feels kind of like flying. There's so much less effort involved. It fits you just exactly the way you want. It works, right? And for us to, it's easy to say, it's easy to talk about things that just work. But as many of you, I'm sure, have experienced, it takes an enormous amount of care and effort and learning to get from what starts out to be a good idea, what starts life as a good idea, and finds its way to being a well-polished experience, right? A meaningful experience that works. And so that's what we're going to talk about for the next little bit, is what open has meant and what it has come to mean and why, and the history of that and how we got here. And I'm sure most of you know that in the beginning of this idea, open meant source. It was open as in code, open source code. And that was born at a time, this idea of open source and open code was born at a time, like all ideas, it was born at a time with a particular economic context. And in the case of the birth of open source, that economic context was at a time when computation was quite scarce. Like, there was very few computers out there. The ability to have access to a computer, like setting aside the ability to manipulate a computer like some innate talent thing, but just raw access to computation as a thing was very, very rare. And what emerged from that was this notion that there was a great deal of effort to be saved and a great deal of ultimately freedom to be obtained in showing your work, in sharing your work, and a great deal of value to be able to see and learn from other people's work rather than repeating it all yourself. The difficulty of that, of course, was the blind spots of that system and the blind spots of that world. By virtue of being limited to largely large corporation and academic settings, by virtue of being an inherently limited environment, which is the environment that most of the original developers of the Mozilla project have come from, it was very easy to view oneself having gained access to this strata of computation, which was, even at the time, widely understood to be sort of very, very powerful and the future and so on. It's very easy to see this as being, you're part of a special group, right? And it was also easy to ignore all of the filters that existed between you and the rest of the world and you and this computer system that you were working on and developing, because those filters at the time were mostly invisible, right? It was very easy to pretend that you were a part of some elite group when, even though you'd worked very hard for these things, you also came up through, you had parents who could afford a computer. You had access to the university system. You lived in a city that had a large company that had access to computer systems and so on. And this was a sort of the early notion of openness as a practice and openness as a field enjoyed a lot of these sort of hidden barriers to access and hidden barriers to accessibility. And then the world changed, right? And part of that change was social and part of that change was economic, because suddenly computers went from being cheap, or pardon me, computers went from being phenomenally expensive and relatively rare to being all of a sudden a lot less expensive and a lot more widely available. And in terms of involvement in the Mozilla project, the historical context of that change was that before you, in the past, I should say, if you wanted to be a part of a project that had global impact, then your options were, you had essentially four options. You had the Linux kernel, you had the Apache project, you had the GNU tools maybe, and you had Mozilla. And you had not a lot of options other than that to work on a project that changed the lives, or that improved the lives of thousands or millions of people. And suddenly that changed. And it changed pretty quickly. We got to a point where we were talking about, limited access to scarce computing resources, to the point where we as an organization were actually now suddenly competing for like attention. Like we are in an environment where now there's GitHub, now there is dozens and dozens and then hundreds and then thousands of software projects, all of whom were now accessible. And as computers got cheaper and computers got more and more accessible and more affordable, the notion of openness shifted from one where we are talking about, like, now we're no longer talking about your ability to have impact at scale, right? Because lots and lots of those opportunities now exist. Now we suddenly are discovering that we need to be competing on like the ergonomics of involvement. Like, the project is still huge. The project is still very important, but now we need to look at it in terms of real barriers to entry. What barriers to entry we didn't need to consider before, because now they were largely invisible. Now we need to put real thought into figuring out how to make it easy to become a part of this organization. Now we need to figure out how to make it easy to go from I want to help to I'm set up to help to I am helping. Right? We need to polish the edges off of that process and treat it not just like a process, but like a product, because this is going to be where the next generation of our participants, where the next generation of our community comes from. And so we put a great deal of work into that, and that work has gone well, except, of course, that then the world changed again, right? And a new notion of what sort of emerged as a form of open started to rise up. And this was a very interesting time, because it meant that all of a sudden the degree of openness, this notion of accessibility, suddenly expanded beyond the code. It expanded to, first of all, the ergonomics of the environment, the ergonomics of your developer processes, the ergonomics of getting involved in your community. And then, like, the next step of that, perhaps obviously in hindsight, was, okay, somebody has figured out how to get involved. Someone has climbed the mountain of your issue tracker. Someone has ascended through all of your code base, and they figured out how to say, hi, I'm here, I'm ready, I'd like to be a part of your community. And then they find out what your community actually looks like when they arrive, and sometimes nope out, right? Sometimes just bail out of that. And that was the point where the third kind of openness here, which is the accessibility, not of your community, not of your technology, I should say, not of your processes, but the accessibility of your culture as an organization, right? How easy is it to become a first-class citizen of your project? How easy is it to become a member in good standing of not just the code base, but of the community that is making all of the decisions around the code base? And that turns out to be a hard problem. But it's one that has, by separating out the idea of code as being sort of the fundamental element of this, has offered a lot of organizations a lot of very real opportunities to talk about their social ergonomics, to talk about their inclusion ergonomics, to talk about the real hard details of getting involved in their mission. And that's where we found ourselves, right? It's a question of, we're not only just competing on code, we're not just competing on accessibility, we're also competing on what you find when you've gotten through all those barriers to access, right? Once you've beaten down, or once you have succeeded in defeating as an individual all of these barriers to participation, what do you find, right? Who are you when you get here? Who has already passed these barriers? And that presents an interesting set of organizational problems that I'm imagining that many of your organizations find as well, right? Is it, once you've climbed this mountain, is it worth being at the top, right? And there's real work that we've had to put in to get ourselves here. And what we've learned ultimately is that that is going to be an ongoing cycle for us, right? more than just accessible tools, more than just accessible processes. We're talking about a very holistic, we're engineering a very holistic environment that working in the open successfully means making sure that you are focused on access and accessibility and every part of your process, and like revisiting the process of getting involved like it's an actual product, figuring out all the places where getting from A to B is difficult because it's actually difficult, or because nobody's taken the time to actually make it easy, right? And in those cases, figuring out what that means to make that better and fix it. So that's sort of the history of open source and open practices, is this constant evolution of trying to break down all of those barriers to getting involved, where getting involved means, where getting involved means making it to the next step of being a part of this community. It's a very challenging exercise because it means approaching a lot of your own assumptions about the world and about how things should be with a great deal of care and humility, because it turns out that humility in getting people involved in your product is really in your culture as well, is really the name of the game. And I'm hoping, and this is a little aspirational on my part, but I'm hoping that this sort of narrative arc that we as an organization have gone through is one that is familiar to you as well. And one where you start out having a great idea and that getting involved can be difficult, right? Okay, so we have the great idea. Now we have to put the work into evangelizing our idea. Now we have to put the work into evangelizing our organization as being the right home for these ideas, right? So like ultimately the answer to so what, the question is, has to do with our theory of change, and maybe more importantly with the whole idea of a theory of change, right? If you're a nonprofit, you have one of these, right? And I apologize, I don't mean to sound patronizing if I say this, but if you are a nonprofit and if you don't have one of these, you need one, right? Because a theory of change is very clearly an expression of your goals and your values as an organization. It is how you market yourselves, it is how you hire, it is how you get funding, it is how you recruit. It is simply the elaboration of your values distilled into a couple of sentences. This is what the world is. This is the way the world is going to be. And this is how we are going to be the people who get it there by doing this work. And you're familiar with this, right? You've had to work this pitch out. But the next question after your theory of change is the how, right? The ergonomics of actually getting involved in this. And this is where the joys of actually working in the open, of actual working through the hard problems of the how really shines, right? Because it is not necessarily about it's not necessarily about the big vision. It is not necessarily about the large detail, the grand plan for the glorious future. A lot of people have that, right? This is where the rubber meets the road, where you work through the problems of how do I get this thing done? How do I solve this particular problem? But working in the open means that not only, which is frankly somewhat terrifying, not only are you working through these in the presence of other people, within sight of other people, but you're also working through those questions while being able to ask who else is solving them, right? By participating in, not just working in the open, but by participating in the larger open source community, suddenly you get to ask questions like this, right? And this is perhaps obvious, it is perhaps naive, but to be able to say quite openly, like, we have a problem, we have this challenge. Are we the only people who have this challenge? Are there other people who've got this challenge, right? In a very crass sense, what we're talking about here is saving labor, right? Like, there's no point in trying to solve problems that are already solved. We've got the unsolved problems that are on our desk that are huge and terrifying, and we need to deal with those, right? But there's more to it than that when we are talking about working in the open, being able to ask questions like in the open, like this in the open, I should say. Because the real questions become, who out there has walked this path before? Who is sharing our experience here? Who among those things, who among those people who are walking either this path or one that looks a lot like it, somewhere adjacent, where are our potential allies there? How can we work together? Maybe for a long time, maybe for just a brief enough time to actually answer this question, right? Who are our possible new collaborators? How do we present not only big ideological or world-spanning problems to people, but also divide them up into a way that makes those problems much more atomic, right? Much smaller, and by virtue of those being smaller and more specific problems, more accessible, right? Easier for people to get that first little baby step of getting involved in, right? And this is just a taste of the larger experience of the sort of ongoing efforts at collaboration, the ongoing soft collaboration of working with people for a time who share a common problem and then moving on, the ongoing longer term collaboration of finding allies at various scales of your company or your organization's life cycle to be able to grow and develop things because you have common interests, right? And what we found over time is that all of these things are fairly tightly wound together, right? There is a cycle between your values and your practices. That's very, very obvious. There is a cycle between your practices and your goals, equally obvious, right? There is a reciprocal relationship there with your tools and your values, and both of those things are expressions ultimately of each other. And that's where Firefox comes in, right? And that's where working in the open comes in. It's not just a piece of software, right? There's more to it than that, right? And let me back that up. The software itself is pretty great. Like, I highly recommend it. And my colleagues in the next one of these talks are going to talk both about how much the software lets you do and how much it keeps people from doing to you, both of which, let me assure you, are fantastic. But the larger question of how do you make changes that matter, those things need to, the tools that you need to choose for that should be tools that believe in user agency, that they should be tools that believe in your choices and respect your choices and help you make those decisions and help you build on top of them in order to change the world for the better, which is, you know, sort of what we're here for. And I think what you're all here for too. And because this is what works, right? This is a set of tools and a set of understandings about how we should work and what the nature of collaboration should look like, and an entire community and ecosystem that believes that this is the right way to do things, that this is a part of a larger way to do work that is shared, where many hands have made a lot of light work, even though all of those hands aren't working on the same things at the same time, right? And having that set of resources available to you, having that ambient collaboration on tap is extraordinarily powerful, right? I say again, once you've had this, you're not going back to not having it, right? The ability to move through a set of problems, to find collaborators, and to work on new world-changing things quickly and easily and frictionlessly, because you're a part of this larger organization and this larger sort of community of practice. That goes a long way. And that is the introductory part of this talk, I think. I hope I've given you enough information that you're interested in continuing to look at it and continuing to look at not just Firefox as a platform and as a tool for collaboration and for development and for finding, you know, new things in the world, but also the practices that Firefox and Mozilla and the larger open source community have brought to the world as perhaps a more important platform, right? A new way of working that is collaborative, effective, and that, you know, with a little bit of faith and good fortune, means that the work we do to add to that collective knowledge will endure and will ultimately change the world, I think, for the better. Coming up for some of these talks, the next two of these talks are going to be from my colleague Mike Capley, who's going to be telling you about the best practices for configuring and setting up Firefox for your enterprise, making it fit, you know, your workflow and making it safe and secure in the way that you choose things to be safe and secure. Later on, my colleague Tyler Duzan will be talking about tracking protection and a lot of the different security features in Firefox that are able to protect you from the world's various bad actors. And I think that both of those things will be interesting and both very much worth your time if you're thinking about working with Firefox and working with the larger open source community as well. And that very nearly brings me to the end. I think we are just barely under time. I couldn't pass up a chance to put this slide on, not for any reason. I couldn't figure out how to work it into the actual talk, but I trust you'll take a moment to just look at it. I felt proud of it, even though I couldn't work it in. Thank you very much. I'm very grateful that all of you had a chance to sit here with me and listen to me go on. Thank you for joining us, and I hope that you will join us for the next 2 episodes of this podcast. And that seems like as good a time as any for me to stop sharing my screen and start, I think, taking questions. One of my favorite facts about penguins is that I learned a few years ago how it is that penguins decide that it's safe to go into the water. And the answer is they don't really decide. It's just a whole bunch of them crowd around the edge of the platform until some of them fall in, and then everyone else stops and watches. So when I learned that, I started actually preceding talks, live talks that I've gone to with just one person to ask some relatively anonymous question, just so that everyone else in the room suddenly felt like they had permission to step forward. It works on live video, or looks in live presentations, I should say. Doesn't work so well on Zoom, unfortunately. But if anybody would like to be today's honorary penguin, I would be delighted to answer questions. Okay.
Mike, is there any questions coming in through the Zoom chat?
Yeah, no, I've checked the Zoom chat. It seems pretty cool. It doesn't look like anyone's jumping in at the moment. My heart will go on. All right. Listen, everyone, thank you very much again for your time.
Mike, there is a question from Victor.
There we go.
Sorry, voice from above. From Victor, he asked directly to me, so I posted it to everyone. Do you want to take a quick look there?
The question is Mozilla able to work with other browser giants like Microsoft and Google on interoperability? It's a bit of a complicated question because there's really there are only 2 browser giants left at the moment, and those are Google and us. But having said that, one of our beliefs for the web is that the web is based on open standards, and a number of our colleagues work to continue to advance that at standards bodies, I should say, pardon me, like the IETF and others, to make sure that the web is more than just a single client piece of infrastructure, and maintains itself as an open interoperable standard so that there exists competition, so that there can continue to be other browsers that emerge over time. So the answer is yes, we can, and we are. And if you'd like to email me, I can be very happy to point you to some of the standards body work that we've done, and the ongoing work that we continue to participate in. So the next question that's coming is, what is the value of open source as it relates to what we tell our security people, our security departments, with regards to which vulnerabilities and which browsers are safest? That is a sort of a large, complicated question. I wish that we could put them in order of safest to least safe. Both the major browser lines, those being the Chromium engine and the Firefox, they respond very quickly, generally, to early breaches, to 0 days, to ongoing security issues. We both have security teams that work to keep our browsers up to date, and when the bad things happen, both of our teams respond very promptly to various different security issues. The fact that our rendering engine, our web-based tools, I should say, work very differently than Chromium's, means that we also have, we both get a little bit of free security, but just by virtue of not being the other person. Like that is something that both browser engines enjoy. There are very few, I think, exploits that work on both. And so that is something that speaks to the importance of having a diverse ecosystem of browsers, of tools. Right now, we think that, right now we have a history, at least in the last couple of years at Mozilla, of being able to spin up releases for new security issues very, very quickly. The Chrome team, of course, has the same. So in terms of pure safety, it's a difficult thing to gauge pure safety, right? And there are always trade-offs to be made when we're talking about safety, in the same way that approximately 0 people driving a car on the highway are wearing a helmet. I don't know if that analogy makes a ton of sense, but everyone makes that trade-off, right? Everyone wears seatbelts but doesn't wear a helmet, even though helmets save lives. But for the most part, both of our organizations react very, very quickly and promptly to security issues as soon as we find them, and we deploy fixes to those equally quickly. I don't think that I would, I don't want to brag and say we're more secure than Chrome. I mean, I kind of do, but I shouldn't. But the truth is that both companies are making an excellent product right now. Any comments on all the browsers using Chromium as a base, closed source browsers using Chromium as a base? I think that if you are strapping yourself to an upstream vendor, you have a very serious set of challenges with respect to making sure that you are keeping things up, making sure that you are maintaining yourself up to date. You get a lot of things for free by I should say, by depending on a well-established rendering engine. And frankly, I wish there were more of them. But closed source forks of browser engines are just generally unhealthy. It's very difficult to know what you can trust when you actually have no ability to look under the hood at all. And to borrow that car analogy again, it's very difficult for most people in modern times to actually repair their cars. There's a great deal of proprietary stuff in them, but the idea of buying a car whose hood was welded shut still feels bad. Like we all kind of know what's at the end of that road. And that's how I feel about closed source browsers of any kind, Chromium or not. The other challenge, of course, of Chromium with closed source tools, and I wonder if I can get a show of hands here in the Zoom chat. If you've ever worked in large-scale enterprise software, if you've ever worked in companies that have had a great deal of longevity, or built systems that were closed source or relied on closed source systems, one of the great downfalls of large organizations that get trapped in that situation is that they become dependent on somebody who goes out of business. They can become dependent on an organization that, for which there is no upgrade path, and for which there is now an insecure dependency, for which you are now downstream of a known security flaw. And at a point, there is literally nothing you can do, right? If a closed source vendor goes belly up, and that closed source vendor is a core part of your ecosystem or a core part of your internal processes, you're in a lot of really, really expensive trouble, right? This is one of the reasons that building things to open standards and building things to widely available and well understood practices is really so important, especially for small to mid-sized shops that are growing, is that if you don't have that option of parting out part of your infrastructure, parting out part of your dependency chain when something proves to be a bad idea, that's an enormous drag on every part of your life, your money, your time, your effort, your ability to execute on more important things. If you have, if you're a bank or an IBM and you have an enormous amount of money to spend on just holding the ground with the status quo, you might be able to get away with that. But God, for small shops, you really, really need to be able to get out from under any piece of software you are working with at any moment if things go sideways. everything else is just too slow, right? It's too much of a drag. And to be blunt, that's where we come in. Is anything else coming in the chat there? I get worked up about this stuff because I've seen what happens to, like back in the day, this was the burden of Internet Explorer 6 that we couldn't get rid of for years and years, even though it was terrible. Because all of these companies had built all of these particular idiosyncrasies on top of all of IE6's particular idiosyncrasies. And it was just unwinding that process meant burning everything to the ground and salting the earth and building a new foundation. Which having been in those trenches, I don't wish on anyone. Anyone else? I'm glancing up at the chat here. We're about 40 minutes in. And so I think that if we are done here, I think that we're done here. Again, thank you very much, everyone. It's been a privilege to speak to you all, and I hope to see you again soon.